Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Manyatela. It's great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, is the US in or out of the G20 summit? The country has made a partial shift in its position. It will have officials represented at the closing ceremony for the purposes of receiving the gavel since the US takes over the G20 presidency next year. So it's no longer a total boycott. What does it all mean? Our reporter Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us for an update. Also on the show, are G20 countries going to agree on a joint declaration at the end of the summit? That's the question, as the US says it will oppose the issuance of a joint declaration. We speak to one of the G20 countries, France. The French ambassador to South Africa, David Martinon, speaks to us. And then later, what is Amazulu Prince Simakade's reaction to claims made by Brown Mogotsi at the Madlanga Commission? Mogotsi has claimed that Prince Simakade's associates have been targeted by the political Killing Stars team and that criminal cases opened against the officers have never been investigated. But is that even the case? We speak to Prince Thokozani Zulu, the spokesperson for Prince Simakade Zulu. But first, my comment. So, we are only a day away from the all-important G20 summit. World leaders have already started arriving today. The B20 summit wrapped up earlier today, and the focus now shifts to the discussions that will take place over the weekend. The world will be watching South Africa, and our country will be at the center of those conversations that will shape the global agenda. The G20 leaders have, for decades now, sought to collaborate and build consensus on mutual global issues. And this year, we have been hosting those collaborations and discussions that have now culminated into the summit taking place this weekend. The G20 presidency gives us the opportunity to strengthen the voice of the global South, to lobby for the structuring of the multilateral organizations like the United Nations Security Council. We want to increase collaboration. We want to secure greater trade relations and increase investment. We want to push for peace and democracy. We want to advocate for issues around climate financing, around a new deal with finance institutions like the IMF regarding African debt, you name it. And some of these issues will find expression in the declaration at the summit this weekend. But the United States initially said it would boycott the summit and oppose the issuance of a joint declaration. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced earlier today that South Africa is discussing with the United States the possibility of its participation in the G20 summit.
We have received notice from the United States, a notice which we are still in discussions with them over, about a change of mind about participating in one shape, form, or other in the summit. So the discussions are still ongoing. This comes really at the late hour before the summit begins. And so therefore we do need to engage in those types of discussions to see how practical it is and what it finally really means. In a way, we see this as a positive sign, very positive, because, as I've often said, boycott politics never work. It's always best to be inside the tent than being outside of the tent.
And of course, as we'll hear from our reporter Sherwin Bryce-Pease, there seems to be some developments on the US's side. We'll get an update on what the decision is now and what possibly informed that decision for the US to want to come to the closing ceremony. So they're still not participating, but they are saying that they will send a delegation to the closing ceremony. This is more of a ceremonial thing where they will receive the gavel because there's a transfer of power moving from South Africa to the United States. Now, Washington made it clear that it will oppose the issuance of any G20 deliverable beyond the chair's statement. The US President Donald Trump had recently said South Africa shouldn't even be hosting the summit.
South Africa shouldn't even be in the G's anymore, because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
But Minister Ronald Lamola said there will be a declaration.
The G20 is a consensus-based organization. There are negotiations that are ongoing, robust, and we are hopeful that we will be able to find each other as the countries that are present to adopt the declaration and be able to take the G20 to move forward. As to whether it will be easy or not, there is emerging kind of consensus within the group, but obviously, as you are aware, it's about 19 countries. It's not easy. There will always be sticking points that have to be ironed out during the negotiation process that is unfolding to end tomorrow.
President Cyril Ramaphosa also said earlier today that there should not be a bullying of other countries.
It cannot be that a country's geographical location or income level or army determines who has a voice and who is spoken down to. And it basically means that there should be no bullying of one nation by another nation. We are all equal.
Now, if this summit doesn't come up with a declaration, it would probably be the first time since the G20 summits began in 2008 not to issue a consensus leaders declaration. The question we're asking you tonight, though, is what message do you think the world leaders this weekend should send to the US? You can send us a WhatsApp voice note right now on 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and your surname and where you're sending the voice note from. Please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can send us an X on Face the Nation SABC. What message do you think world leaders at this weekend's G20 summit should send to the US? What do you make of the latest developments with the US Embassy now sending this diplomatic note to DERCO saying they will have a delegation, not to participate, but at the closing ceremony as the transfer of the presidency happens from South Africa to the United States. After the break, we speak to our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease about the latest on this. Stay with us here on Face the Nation.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa has been in discussions with the United States around the possibility of participating in the G20 summit after an initial boycott. Ramaphosa was speaking at joint news conference with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the U.S. Council President Antonio Costa. U.S. President Donald Trump had earlier announced that the U.S. would not attend the summit in Johannesburg and no final statement by the G20 leaders would be issued without its presence. SABC News U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us now for the latest. Sherwin, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening. I mean, the U.S. seems to be all over the place, quite frankly. First they were coming, then they were not, and then the vice president was coming and then not. And now they've confirmed that they are sending the chargé d'affaires to receive the gavel, which basically represents the transfer of power. What do we understand about this latest development?
Look, maybe we can expect a change in position tomorrow. It's Friday. It's still early, 2 days before the end of the summit. Maybe another change on Saturday and then Sunday. Who knows how the wind will blow in that regard, Clement. But certainly, let me read you what we received from a U.S. government spokesperson. Quote, the chargé d'affaires in Pretoria will attend the handover ceremony as a formality, but the United States is not joining the G20 discussions. Now, the charge d'affaires is essentially the person in charge of the United States Embassy. You'll know there is no ambassador confirmed yet by the United States Senate. That process is still unfolding, so this would be the top residential official in South Africa for the US government, essentially agreeing to show up to receive the handover from the South African government. But in private discussions that I've had with certain officials, the sentiment expressed is that they will not be participating in discussions. We can debate that, the extent to which that might or might not be true, but the official word from the United States is that they will only be engaging in the handover ceremony. So essentially, filling the chair that President Ramaphosa thought might be empty at the conclusion of deliberations come Sunday.
Yeah, and as you say, anything can change. We may very well talk about something completely different by tomorrow. What are their expectations from the South African government? Do we know? Because it seems like there's a diplomatic note that was sent by the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria to DERCO, where they're asking DERCO to make these accommodation and travel arrangements for this U.S. delegation. I mean, that would be a logistical nightmare if there are those arrangements that would need to be made now. Do we know if they've got any expectations, if they need any assistance from the South African government?
I would push back that it would be a logistical nightmare. I think the South Africans are very open. You heard President Cyril Ramaphosa's remarks there. They're hoping for greater, they've always hoped for greater engagement from the United States. And I think the South African government would accommodate a larger, more affirmative delegation from the United States that wanted to engage in discussion, even albeit at a very late stage. As you well know, Clement, the deliberations at the Sherpa level have been ongoing for a number of days now. They are close to a conclusion. Those deliberations, negotiations, that's to the outcome document, tend to go until the last minute. But the United States, as a G20 member, would be quite able to insert itself in deliberations at any point in time. And certainly the posture from the South African government is that they are seeking to have a declaration, they are seeking to move forward with or without the United States, but were the United States to re-engage, the South African government would certainly be open to that. Remember, there is a bilateral relationship at play here as well. The South Africans are very much engaged in trade negotiations, seeking to lower the 30% tariff, the unilateral reciprocal tariff imposed by the United States president. There have been intense negotiations, both under the auspices of the Trade and Industry and Competition Minister, Park Stow, and Alistair Reuters, the presidential trade advisor. And so we've heard from the South Africans that those negotiations are at a very pivotal point. And so the bilateral relationship is very closely linked to the multilateral format that South Africa is engaged in here. So I think a broad openness were the United States to engage beyond just receiving the gavel.
Yeah, and so just to be clear then, Sherwin, them deciding to come at the closing ceremony, that is more ceremonial than anything. Then if that's the case, this is not really a significant diplomatic shift.
Yes, I mean, it's neither here nor there until we see exactly what the United States' intentions are, right? Are they going to possibly engage? There was certainly an opening that the president sought to, is seeking to thread the needle and, have the camel go through the eye of the needle. And I think you saw an openness there from President Ramaphosa. But the very fact that the United States is engaging at this very late stage, on whatever level that might be, is significant, given the pronouncement from President Trump that there will be no U.S. official, no U.S. delegation at all at the South Africa Leaders Summit. So that in and of itself is a major development. But the United States posture has been very clear about its disassociation from the theme of this G20 summit. It does not agree with the sentiments of equality, sustainability, and solidarity. It does not want that to mean a climate, a cover for climate change. This is what Marco Rubio tweeted about. He said it was cover for diversity, equity, and inclusion. The things President Ramaphosa, in broad terms today, very much asserted. And so the U.S. has made clear they do not affirm the Sustainable Development Agenda. They do not affirm the Sustainable Development Goals. They believe climate change is a hoax. They believe renewable energy is the biggest scam this side of the century. And so we know that they're not going to agree with pretty much everything that's going to be in that document, because it's very sustainable development focused and centric. And so there should be no surprise that the United States is not going to agree with an outcome document, because they basically said so.
Yeah, and of course, so that is the issue of the declaration, and I wonder what the other countries' positions will be, right? Will the leaders crumble under the US President Donald Trump's pressure when it comes to this joint declaration? I mean, some of the countries don't want to annoy the US President. I mean, the French President has been very clear in that they do support and are pushing for a declaration. We're going to speak to the French ambassador in a moment. Who knows what Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister's position is going to be. Do we know sort of what the different countries' position is 2 days before that summit in as far as that joint declaration is concerned?
I think broadly countries around the G20 table, right, the ones that will vote on a declaration or assert a declaration, including the invited guests, are very much affirming the Sustainable Development Goals. But let me give you a quick example of two G20 member states, the Saudis and the French. You're going to speak to the French ambassador. What did they recently engage in? They were the two co-facilitators of what was known as the Two-State Solution Conference as it related to the Palestinian question at the United Nations recently. And that process was heavily criticized by, guess, the United States. And what they were able to usher in and facilitate those two countries, G20 members, was to buck the criticism from the United States, to ignore the criticism from the United States, and forge ahead. And you saw a number of countries, the United Kingdom, the Canadians, the Australians, and a number of others affirming their view that a two-state solution is the only viable end game for this intractable conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so it is not unusual to see countries that want to agree with the United States at times disagree with them. And I don't think that necessarily changes under the auspices of South Africa's presidency at the G20 over the weekend.
SABC US correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, thank you so much. Always great to chat to you. Let's wait to see what happens before Saturday. As Sherwin said, anything is really possible. At some point, we thought we were going to hand over the presidency of South Africa to an empty chair. And then we thought the vice president was coming. And then now the US then said it's not coming. Now we are told that they'll come to the closing ceremony just as a ceremonial thing for the handover of the G20 presidency. After the break, we're going to have a conversation with the French ambassador to South Africa as we try to figure out how countries are going to approach that issue of the joint declaration. Which countries are going to fold under the US President Donald Trump's pressure, and which countries are going to push for a declaration? That conversation coming up after the break. Stay with us.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Welcome back. Several nations have supported South Africa's efforts to obtain a joint statement at this weekend's G20 summit. These include Germany, the UK, and France. French President Emmanuel Macron has backed South Africa, pushing for a strong declaration despite the US's opposition. The US warned South Africa against pushing for a joint statement at the summit and said it would neither participate in preparatory talks nor the gathering of world leaders this weekend. David Martinon is the ambassador of France to South Africa, Lesotho, and Malawi, joining us now via Zoom. Ambassador, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I want to start off with news that came in not so long ago around the US Embassy in Pretoria sending that diplomatic note to DERCO and indicating that there will be a delegation coming to the closing ceremony. It's more of a ceremonial thing where they will come and receive the gavel since they're taking over the presidency next year. How significant do you think this is, given that they're still not participating in the summit, but they're coming for the purposes of that transfer of power?
Well, obviously, that is quite unusual. I've never seen that. I have participated in many G20 ministerial meetings under the South African presidency. Sometimes the Americans were there, not mostly, but obviously they participated in the 3 Sherpa meetings. So, yeah, we have mixed feelings in a way. It means that they are eager to continue the good work and assume the presidency next January. So that's good news. However, not participating in the G20 summit is bad news because obviously they will not participate in any attempt to make progress. And obviously, if we are trying to have a declaration, a communiqué, as we say, then it means that we are trying to solve problems, to mitigate differences, and to make progress in defining clear directions. So, yeah, of course, that's why we are pushing as France to have a strong declaration. But again, the principle of multilateralism, and especially in the G20 format, is that it has to be consensual.
Yeah. What message do you think the world leaders need to send through this summit, especially to the US over the weekend? Because the summit is taking place at a time when there are these attempts to suppress global cooperation and solidarity. And I wonder how important it is that the summit sort of assets the importance of this global cooperation.
So there would be two ways to answer your question. I believe, first of all, would be, hey, even if the US decide not to participate, the challenges and the global challenges that the whole world is facing are there. And we don't have the option to lose time. So we have to get together and find solutions. And the second is, if you consider the priorities of the South African presidency, as you said earlier, obviously France supports them very strongly. We do attach the same kind of significance to the question of financing of development. The fact that President Ramaphosa has put the question of the cost of capital for developing countries on the table is also very significant and very useful. It's even critical. And we're here to support the presidency. As you said, again, global finance, but also climate change are issues that we can't neglect as a global community. And on that, again, as the South African presidency, we are on the position that people shouldn't have to choose between development and facing global change, climate change. So that's why we are really here to help the South African presidency.
Yeah. And what are the consequences of the US rejecting the declaration that comes out of the summit? Because their argument is, well, we were not part of it, but this is the country that's going to take over the presidency. So in some way, you do want their buy-in so that they are able to also, together with other countries, track the progress with a reference point being the declarations from this year.
So again, I would put two things ahead. First of all, it means that the Americans are willing to take responsibility for the next G20 presidency. How will they conduct their presidency? We will need clarity. I remember the first Sherpa meeting, the American representative said that the intention was to streamline the agenda. That's up to the presidency to make some choices and show, again, determination to make progress. And we'll see when we will be there. However, the whole world is watching. So even if the US don't agree with the communiqué, it won't prevent the South African presidency to issue a chair statement in which President Ramaphosa, as the chair, will sort of, synthesize the discussions. So in a way, you may say it's not a communiqué, but for the rest of the world, we know where we are, and we know that the conversations at least were fruitful, even without the US.
From the conversations that
we're really pushing for a strong declaration.
Yes.
But I can't jump to the conclusion. That's the job of the Sherpas, who are right now negotiating between them to reach the best text they can.
Yeah. There's been some concern that the US could very well argue that, the principle of reaching the G20 declaration is by consensus. And if the US hasn't participated, means they have not agreed to it. But as you said earlier, how would they agree to it if they are not there participating? Is there a concern that there are some countries within the G20 that may be wary of defying the US so openly? Because then they could be facing pressure from the United States. I know as France, as you've said, you've indicated that you support a declaration. There are other countries that have come out to say clearly that that is important. Do you think that there is concern that some countries may sort of be wary and step back a little bit here?
So I'm a diplomat, right? I'm a professional diplomat. And the beauty of diplomacy and the beauty of multilateralism is to never name and shame. The beauty of it is to stick to courtesy, to discuss, to take the necessary time to reach the best text and the best agreement. So you won't hear me tonight naming any country. However, if you want to dig into it, again, as I said, I've been participating and representing my country in many G20 ministerial meetings, and that's something we have seen. So there has been, if I'm not mistaken, 18 ministerial meetings. 9 of them managed to get a text. So everything is possible. Let's not jump to conclusions.
And without digging too much there, when you say they managed to get the text, what do you mean?
So there were several statements. Sometimes it was a communique.
Yeah.
And I've seen that, notably at the Trade and Investment G20 ministerial meeting, I believe, the one dedicated to crisis management. I do remember that at the culture ministerial meeting, there was a kind of a consensual declaration. I do remember that Minister George during the environment ministerial meeting managed to get a joint declaration too. So you see, there were several examples of consensual text.
Okay, got you. Just the last one on the issue of the declaration. Is it, if the US, of course, doesn't participate and they only are here as a ceremonial, way, is it going to be difficult to implement the decisions of this G20 summit when the US takes over the presidency? So if they continue not to participate and they only come for the transfer of the G20 presidency, are we likely to face some difficulties in as far as the implementations of the decisions of the summit?
So again, what I can say is that it's the job of the presidency, it's the mission of the presidency to organize its mandate, to organize logistically, to define the priorities of the year, but they can't make it happen by themselves. So that's the principle of the G20. That's multilateralism. It's it's grounded in common discussions. And if you want to influence, if you want to bring to fruition your ideas, then you need to convince.
Yeah. You've said, Ambassador, that as France, you are here to help the South African presidency. What issues do you think the world needs to focus on? What do you believe as France needs to be on the global agenda for the next year? And then you've had the advantage of spending some time on the continent. What do you think are some of the pressing issues that should be under the global microscope for the next year?
So, being the first G20 organized in Africa, we are really eager to make it a presidency dedicated to development. And you may remember that President Ramaphosa came to Paris back in June 2023 for the global summit that was organized and chaired by President Macron around the finance on development. And we are convinced by the ideas that President Ramaphosa is pushing since the beginning of the year on how to finance development, on how to mitigate the cost of capital for developing countries and how to access capital, because that is really of the essence. And again, the particular attention of President Ramaphosa on climate change and how to cope with it. All these are absolutely critical priorities, and that's why we are exactly on the same page. As you know, France and South Africa also share the same kind of very strong attachment to multilateralism and to the United Nations Charter. We have exactly the same approach on those topics. And again, as I said, the presidency needs support, and we are here to help the presidency.
All right. David Martinon, French ambassador to South Africa, thank you so much for making time for us. Here's a reminder of that question we are asking you tonight. What do you think of the latest developments with the US deciding that they will now come to the closing ceremony, but this is more ceremonial? It's just so that their power or the G20 presidency can be transferred from South Africa to the US because they take over the presidency next year. But also, what message do you think world leaders at this weekend's G20 summit should send to the United States? Let's look at some of your tweets that have come through so far. In fact, let's go for a quick ad break. We'll look at those tweets after the break. Stay with us.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Welcome back. Let's go to some of your tweets that have come through responding to the question we've been asking you tonight about the G20 that is taking place this weekend. What message do you think world leaders should be sending to the US, particularly because they initially were going to come and then they were not going to come, and now the latest is that they will be sending a delegation, but that delegation will be there just for the transfer of power of the G20 presidency from South Africa to the US and not to participate still at the G20 summit. Dennis on Twitter says the G20 should urge the US to recommit to international cooperation, highlighting the need for collective action to tackle global challenges, emphasizing the importance of global cooperation and collective responsibility in addressing pressing issues like economic inequality. The US needs to understand, this is what Bono says, the US needs to understand that the world doesn't revolve around them. They are not the economic hub of the world. South Africa handled the boycott very well by not begging them to attend the G20 summit. Minister Lamula made it clear that the summit will go on with or without them. Rabutata says the world leaders should advise the USA not to undermine the sovereignty of other nations. The USA should stop to think that they are the world and they must show utmost respect for others. In fact, more world leaders are arriving. In fact, we're taking you now live, where you see there on the tarmac the Chinese delegation arriving. The Premier Li Qiang is leading the delegation and not the Vice President Han Zheng. He isn't coming, and of course we've been told that President Xi Jinping is not going to be attending, but the Chinese delegation there is going to be represented by Li Qiang, who is representing China at the G20 presidency in Johannesburg. World leaders have been arriving throughout the day today as Johannesburg prepares to host the G20 summit this weekend. These world leaders are going to have some important issues on the table to discuss, and of course there are more and more questions around what their posture will be towards the joint declaration. That's what we were discussing with the French ambassador. There are a number of countries that have already come out to indicate that they will support South Africa. They are pushing for a declaration. The US has already said we are not going to recognize any declaration beyond the chair's statement. But China may be one of those countries, given that it's always been an ally of South Africa, to support the declaration. But these are world leaders arriving, currently watching live visuals from that tarmac as we see the arrival of the Chinese delegation led by Premier Li Qiang, who is representing China in the absence of the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Let's move to this now. Controversial Northwest businessman Brown Mogotsi has told the Madlanga Commission that KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Commissioner Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi used the political killings task team to target Amazulu Prince Simakade Zulu's allies. Mogotsi claimed that criminal cases opened against the officers have never been investigated. Prince Simakade Zulu is the half-brother of King Zulu and has opposed his recognition as the legitimate Zulu king. Now, Prince Thokozani Zulu is the spokesperson for Prince Simakade Zulu, and he joins us now via Zoom. Thank you so much for making time for us, Prince Thokozani Zulu. Good evening.
Evening to you, Clement. Evening to your viewers at home, and thanks for having me on this distinguished platform.
Was Prince Simakade at all surprised about the comments that were made by Brown Mogotsi this week at the Madlanga Commission?
In fact, we need to indicate that substantially the allegations leveled by Mr. Brown Mogotsi at the Madlanga Commission have been surprising, insofar as they purport to suggest that His Majesty King Simakade or certain members of the Zulu royal family that are aligned to King Simakade are either associating with him, interacting with him, or cooperating with him. We wish to distance His Majesty from such allegations. Also, the insinuation that His Majesty opened a case against General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, that is not true. And it is important to mention that there was a case that was opened, a criminal case, by Prince Madlanga Zulu, who is the senior prince of Manzi Royal House, but it wasn't a case that was opened against General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi. Also, it's important to indicate that no information relating to the operations at Richards Bay Harbour or confidential information was provided by His Majesty or the Senior Prince of Manzi to Brown Mogotsi, and also to indicate that we have not received any assistance from Brown Mogotsi, either financial, logistical, or otherwise.
Yeah. Well, Prince Thokozani Zulu, if you will allow me, I'd like us to go back and take it, step by step, because there are a lot of things that you've just mentioned now. Let's first start with the issue of the case, because what Brown Mogotsi indicated to the Madlanga Commission was that there were cases that were opened. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he alleged that there are cases relating to alleged intimidation, harassment, and attempted murder of members of the royal household associated with Prince Simakade, which were never investigated or acted upon by the SAPS. He also alleged that General Mkhwanazi sent the political killings task team to target the Amazulu Prince Simakade Zulu's associates. So you're telling us this evening that that is a big fat lie?
No, I'm not saying it's a big fat lie. All what I'm indicating is the manner in which he puts it. He suggests that when Prince Mazwendoda opened the case, it was through his intervention. That is not the case.
Okay.
However, yes, however, it is true that Prince Mazwendoda was harassed by police, that for the fear of his life, for his life, he elected to open a case in Midrand, which case was then transferred to Wanongoma. And it's true that that case has not been investigated since August last year. It's true that a number of police officers attacked Enyogeni Royal Palace on the 16th of September 2022, and we have not received any feedback from the police relating to who authorized that operation, who commanded it, who are the members of the SAPS that were involved, and so on.
So you don't know if those police officers were members of the political killings task team. You just know that there were officers that have come to the home of Prince Simakade Zulu.
Yes, we don't know yet, but that is the matter that is going to be ventilated appropriately at an appropriate platform.
Mm-hmm. Does Prince Simakade Zulu or any of those close to him have interacted before with Brown Mogotsi? And I'm asking that question because he seems to have information about the behavior, quote unquote, of these police officers towards the associates of Prince Simakade Zulu. He seems to have information also about when the case was actually opened here in Johannesburg in Midrand, and then it had to be transferred all the way to KwaZulu-Natal. Do you know how he was able to have access to that information?
We believe that he had access to that information like any other information that he is in possession of relating to even operational issues of the intelligence. We believe that he sourced that information from his sources within the police. We believe that the reason why Brown Mogotsi has implicated His Majesty King Simakade is to divert adverse attention away from his conduct that is under scrutiny before the Commission. Further, we have reasons to believe that his effort to implicate His Majesty is to tarnish the impeccable public standing of His Majesty King Simakade, so that if it happens that he goes down, he would then go down with His Majesty.
I mean, one of the wild allegations that he's made is that the brother of Prince Simakade is a CIA agent. And the way that he portrayed this, even at the Madlanga Commission, and he wasn't able, of course, to substantiate any of these claims, but the way that he was positioning it at the Madlanga Commission, and by also mentioning Prince Simakade as well, and how, you know, the West always wanted, because they've had interest, they've always had an interest in how things turn out in the Zulu royal family. The indication there was sort of like, well, maybe Prince Simakade as well believes that claim. Do you have any response to this wild claim that he's made that he has not been able to substantiate in as far as King Mrs. Zulu is concerned?
As you would have observed, Clement, it would appear to us no one takes Mr. Brown Mogotsi's testimony before the Commission. It appears that he spews hogwash, because you'll recall that even senior advocate Matthew Choskalson pulverized the testimony that he presented before the commission. So we believe that, like all other witnesses before the commission, he has to present evidence to that effect of whatever nature. And we further distance His Majesty or members of the Zulu royal family aligned to His Majesty relating to those allegations of Brigadier Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi's association and His Royal Highness Prince Misuzulu's association to the CIA. We have no dealings with Brown Mogotsi. In fact, His Majesty and in fact all of us have never seen him even from a bar of soap.
Yeah, look, you are one of the many people that he has mentioned at the Madlanga Commission who are probably shocked that he's somehow associating himself with them. Just to take you back to the matter of Richards Bay, because one of the things that he mentioned was that there was concern about the possible halting of coal exports from Richards Bay, and that's one of the reasons why now the West had an interest in this matter from the royal family. Are you able to clarify with us if King Simakade has any interests with that particular Richards Bay mine?
In fact, you will recall that the evidence that was presented by Mr. Brown Mogotsi was contradicted. For King Simakade, he wouldn't only be interested on a particular operation in the province of KwaZulu-Natal or the Zulu Kingdom, but does have interest in the entire Zulu nation and the issues that are facing the people of KwaZulu-Natal insofar as economic opportunities are concerned and development. But what was presented by Mr. Brown Mogotsi there is hogwash.
Do you have any plans to take him on? Of course, he was asked some really tough questions by the Madlanga Commission. They disputed most of what he said, as you say, even with some factual information that contradicts the information is provided. But given that you have said your consent just about the association he's claiming here and the comments that he has made, some of which are false because he seems to position himself as someone who intervened and assisted in the laying of criminal charges or the laying of criminal charges against some members of the SAPS. Do you think there's appetite here to take him on, or you're just dismissing what he said? You're not considering even any legal action against him?
We have indeed solicited advice from His Majesty's legal representatives, and we await their feedback on this matter, on what to do relating to these allegations, this far-fetched allegation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Prince Thokozani Zulu, thank you so much for speaking to us. He speaks on behalf of Prince Simakade Zulu, who, of course, Brown Mogotsi has mentioned at the Madlanga Commission, and Brown Mogotsi indicating that he has somehow intervened to help Prince Simakade Zulu's associate come out and open a case. He was able to even provide some details of how there was a case that was opened in Midrand, and the matter had to be transferred back to KwaZulu-Natal. As we wrap up the show, we take you back where the arrival of the Chinese delegation takes place. As you can see now, the Premier, Li Qiang, is leading the delegation that is arriving now as world leaders prepare for this G20 summit. They're arriving to reign, and it's not the first leader to arrive throughout the day. Today we've seen the arrival of other world leaders, and all of them arriving ahead of this all-important G20 summit, which are going to have some of the most critical issues under the microscope over the weekend. And once again, the issue of whether or not there will be a declaration, we will find out on Sunday. As you heard from the French ambassador, we heard even from the French ambassador that there are negotiations that are still taking place. Li Shang is the premier there who is going to be representing the leader of China, Xi Jinping, who, by the way, has not really been attending some international engagements. You'll remember there was that COP30 conference in Brazil not so long ago. He wasn't able to attend that as well. There are some other international engagements that he wasn't able to attend as well. So this is no different. And of course, even local Chinese media has indicated that the issue of his age may also be part of the reason why he has not been meeting some of his international obligation. But there you have it, Premier Li Qiang, who is leading the Chinese delegation arriving in South Africa ahead of the G20 summit. I now hand over to Oliver Dixon, who is going to be taking over from 9 o'clock.